is in Urdu. And the other is في ظلال القرآن by Sayyid Qutb, the Egyptian scholar. And some portions of it, Juz Amma and a few other scattered portions of it, have been translated into English also. Now, to set this topic in some historical perspective, these are tafsirs of basically the first half of the 20th century, the Common Era. And if we look at the Islamic world at the beginning of the 20th century, probably the majority of the Muslim world at that time was under the direct rule of non-Muslims. India, which had been ruled by Muslims, had long since been conquered by the British, and that was the Indian subcontinent was the single largest population of Muslims. And Indonesia was under Dutch rule, Malaysia, and portions of North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and large portions of Central Asia. They were under either French or British or Russian rule, or Italian. And so you see that directly a very large portion of the Islamic world was ruled by European non-Muslims. The major exceptions were Afghanistan and the Ottoman Empire. We should really mention the Ottoman Empire first because they were considered a major world power. Afghanistan was sort of on the peripheries of where things were happening, so to speak. And Afghanistan's main source of importance in world events was that it was between Russian expansion and the British Empire in India, and the British were afraid of the Russians posing a threat to India through Afghanistan. So there was what they called the Great Game, where they were always juggling for power and influence and sometimes direct domination. And they failed in occupying Afghanistan, but the British were able to get this much out of it, that their foreign policy, Afghan foreign policy, was under British control. In the Ottoman Empire, the Ottomans had suffered military defeat after military defeat. A lot of the lands that were nominally Ottoman subjects were actually being controlled by the British, such as Egypt. And even in the Ottoman heartland, the Ottoman government was heavily indebted to European banks, and European powers thus could tell the Ottomans, they could impose upon them concessions regarding commercial law, regarding the status of Christians in the Ottoman Empire. And so really on every front, the Muslims were in retreat as far as politically, and also they had a deep sense of their own cultural inferiority. You know, they're confronted with this vibrant and aggressive culture that was getting the better of them on every front. So you had all kinds of people in the Muslim lands who were looking at these people and saying, well, what do they have that we don't have? And so you had this tremendous groundswell among intellectuals and the leadership of the Muslims that we have to learn from these people, we have to take from them. And so a lot of that turned into just blind imitation. Well, whatever they have, let's take it. And they thought that would get them out of their backwardness and their weakness. And within a decade and a half, within a decade and a half of the dawn of the 20th century, the Ottoman Empire was fighting for its life, and it lost. So with the end of World War I, the Ottoman Empire was completely dismantled. Everything outside of Turkey was occupied by either the British or the French, and they carved it all up into these little nation states. What happened in the wake of World War I was the beginning of a reaction among Muslims. Wait a minute, all of this imitation, it's not getting us anywhere. And the reason that we're weak is that we've left our religion. And we need to go back to our religion and find out how to apply it in modern times without turning a blind eye or rejecting elements that can be of use to us, like technology, etc., in what the Westerners have, but not taking everything. And that we have to re-examine the Qur'an and develop a civilization based upon its principles. And we can plug in certain things from what the West have in the way of technical know-how or matters of that type, but that basically we have something which is better than what they have, but our tragedy is that we've failed to have a direct contact with the divine guidance, which is represented in the Qur'an, and that the only way out of our difficulty is to reestablish a relationship with the Book of Allah, and then to understand that this book was revealed to a people, a community that took guidance from it to change themselves and to change the world. And if we're not involved in doing those two jobs, trying to change ourselves and change the world in an organized movement, then we cannot possibly read the Qur'an and understand its discourse, because it was addressed as a guidebook to a movement. And if we're not moving, if we're just sitting there, then we're, as the Arabs say, نحن في واد وهو في واد. We're in one valley and it's in another. So we're not on the same page. So that was the basic realization and starting point of these Islamist movements. In the Indian subcontinent, Jamaat Islami, founded by Maulana Maududi, and in Egypt, it was the Ikhwan al-Muslimun, founded by Hassan al-Banna, and both of these movements were founded in the 20s. After World War I, not only was the Ottoman Empire dismantled, but the last vestiges of an Islamic political order, even though it was hardly anything Islamic left about it. It was Islam virtually in name only, but the Khilafah, the Ottoman Caliphate, was abolished in the early 1920s. And so then there was a reaction, and one of the things that developed from this reaction was the founding of these two movements. And in that period between the two world wars, the political agenda in the Third World was dominated by independence movements. And the Islamist movements were competing for the hearts and minds, first of all, of the educated and those who shape opinion and people of influence. So they were targeting those people, and secondarily the masses, in order to win their hearts and minds for supporting the vision of the Islamic movement's project, which became increasingly focused on the idea that for societies, Muslim societies, to be truly Islamic, you had to have Islamic government. because they looked around and they saw, well, the non-Muslims have put in place an educational system, and at that time it wasn't that powerful, but a media system to influence the minds and the outlook of the masses. And that all of these were taking people further and further away from the Islamic vision of life. And that if Islamists could get their hands on the state, then they could fix those problems. They could redress those issues. And so they saw that as being the solution to a whole myriad of problems. If you get committed Muslims running the state, then they can make the population, they can shape them to have an Islamic viewpoint. Now, how do you get control of the state when non-Muslims are in control of it? Well, they were, in the period between the two wars, there's this groundswell of independence movement. So they were competing with secularists in order to have the reins, the leadership of those independence movements. What happened after World War II is that all of these small nation states, the Muslim world was divided into more than 50 of these small nation states. They got their independence basically after World War II. In that period, from 1945 until 1960, by the end of that period, or the early 60s, let's say a 20-year period after World War II, virtually every country, the Europeans had pulled out officially, and there was some native regime in place. In all of those regimes, the rulers they had a secular outlook. They were secular nationalists. So now there's another problem. You know, the obvious enemy has been pushed out, but now you have these people who, if we refer to the hadith, the Prophet ﷺ, he gave this prediction that, you know, a variety of fitan, trials that would beset the Muslim Ummah, and eventually there would be people, inviters at every gate leading to hell. And the Sahaba said, describe them for us, O Messenger of Allah, so that we might recognize them. And he said, Hum min jildatina wa yatakallamuna bi alsinatina. They will be of our complexion, and they will be speaking our tongues. They will be speaking our languages. So, you know, they will be of us, but not of us. In other words, their vision would be different. So that was the great challenge of post-independence for these Islamic movements, was how do you confront regimes where there's no longer a public recognition of these people still being un-Islamic. You know, before, when there was white faces ruling these third world countries, it was clear that those people were the other. But now you have native faces occupying those positions, but the basic structure of society and the goals of life and everything is still in place as the colonialists had left it. So it's actually a more effective way to control those countries than having a visible other in charge. If you can control it from behind the scenes with those native faces showing the people that they're controlling their own destiny, supposedly, then it's just much more difficult to summon local opposition to that system. So that was the big challenge of these Islamic